The Nexus Station Cantina had seen its share of diplomatic failures, but rarely had one species managed to derail 3 separate peace negotiations in a single rotation. The human sat alone at the bar, methodically working through what the Altarian bartender had optimistically labeled whiskey, but which bore more resemblance to industrial solvent. Her dress uniform, crisp navy blue with an impressive collection of ribbons, looked almost ceremonial against the backdrop of the cantina's deliberately neutral decor. "She doesn't look particularly dangerous," observed Counselor Vex High, his mandibles clicking nervously as he studied the human from across the room. The Thorian diplomat's compound eyes tracked every movement the woman made, from the precise way she lifted her glass to the controlled stillness of her posture. Perhaps the reports were exaggerated. Ambassador Krelon, a Zalani with the unfortunate tendency to mistake idealism for wisdom, flexed his iridescent wing membranes dismissively. "The stories about human military prowess are clearly propaganda. Look at her. She's barely larger than a juvenile Craxi. How threatening could one small biped possibly be?" The question hung in the recycled air, like a challenge to the universe's sense of irony. A low rumble emanated from the corner booth, where Trade Minister Gorth had been nursing the same drink for 2 hours. The massive Craxi's rocky hide scraped against the reinforced furniture as he shifted position. "Small things often carry the deadliest venom, young Zalani. On my homeworld, we learned not to judge predators by their size." "Predators?" Krelon's voice rose an octave, causing several nearby patrons to glance in their direction. "We're discussing a diplomatic representative, not some feral beast. The humans sent her here to negotiate mining rights, not to hunt." The bartender, whose species possessed the evolutionary advantage of selective hearing when it came to interspecies tensions, continued polishing glasses with 4 arms, while pretending not to eavesdrop on conversations that could reshape galactic politics. He'd served drinks to representatives from 73 different worlds, and he'd learned that the most dangerous customers were often the ones who sat quietly and paid their tabs without complaint. "Perhaps we should ask her directly," Krelon announced, his confidence fueled by equal parts curiosity and Altarian wine. A simple question to settle this ridiculous speculation about human warfare. Counselor Vexhigh's mandibles clicked in what might have been laughter or terror. "By all means, young diplomat. I'm sure she'll appreciate the inquiry." The Zalani straightened his ceremonial robes and approached the bar with the purposeful stride of someone about to make a spectacular mistake. The human didn't acknowledge his presence immediately, though her posture suggested she'd been tracking his approach since he'd left his seat. When she finally turned, her expression held the patient boredom of someone who'd spent considerable time explaining obvious things to slow children. "Commander Torres," Krelon began formally, "I hope I'm not disturbing your evening." "You are, but I appreciate the courtesy of asking." Her voice carried a slight accent that the translation algorithms couldn't quite place, and her dark eyes held the kind of steady focus that made lesser beings reconsider their life choices. "What can I do for you, Ambassador?" "Well, there's been some discussion about human military capabilities, and I thought perhaps you could settle a debate." Krelon's confidence wavered slightly under her gaze, but diplomatic pride pushed him forward. "As a former military officer, surely you could provide some perspective on the stories we've heard." Stories. The word came out flat, neither question nor statement. About human soldiers, combat experiences, that sort of thing. Krelon glanced back at his table of observers, gathering courage from their attention. "Specifically, we were wondering, and please forgive the directness, but how many enemies have you personally killed in combat?" The cantina didn't exactly fall silent, but conversations diminished to respectful murmurs as various species strained to overhear the exchange. The human's expression didn't change, but something in her stillness suggested the question had activated protocols that civilized beings preferred to leave dormant. Commander Torres took a slow sip of her drink, set the glass down with mechanical precision, and smiled. The expression never reached her eyes. I stopped counting after my first war. The words landed with the soft impact of a blade finding flesh. Krelon blinked rapidly, his wing membranes fluttering as he processed the implications. Behind him, Counselor Vex High's mandibles had gone completely still, a sure sign of either deep contemplation or impending molt. "Your first war?" Krelon managed. "The first Martian independence conflict. Nasty business." Torres signaled the bartender for another drink, her movements casual despite the growing audience. 3 years of fighting in tunnels and domed cities. Urban warfare in low gravity with improvised weapons and recycled air. I was 19. "And you lost count of your kills during that conflict?" This from Trade Minister Gorth, whose gravelly voice carried easily across the cantina. "Oh, I kept meticulous records during Mars. Had to. Command required confirmation for ammunition requisition reports." Torres accepted her refill with a nod of thanks. But then came the Jovian separatist movement, then the Belt Miners Rebellion, then the Europa incident, which we don't officially acknowledge happened. After that, the Second Martian War, which was considerably less polite than the first. The bartender had stopped pretending to work and was now openly staring. His species had fought exactly one war in their recorded history, had won it decisively, in 6 days, and had spent the subsequent 3 centuries celebrating their martial prowess. The concept of multiple wars involving the same individual was outside his cultural framework. "How many wars?" asked a new voice. Dr. Yithara, the station's chief xenobiologist, had emerged from the medical bay, still wearing her research smock. "How many conflicts has your species engaged in recently?" Torres appeared to consider the question seriously. "Define recently." "The past standard decade." "Major conflicts or minor engagements?" "Major conflicts." Torres counted on her fingers, paused, started over. 17, no, 18. I forgot about the Titan Mining Consortium dispute, but that was mostly corporate security forces, so maybe it doesn't qualify as a proper war. Dr. Yithara's chromatophores flickered through several colors that didn't translate well into standard Galactic, but which roughly conveyed the concept of existential horror mixed with professional fascination. Her species had evolved from herd animals and viewed conflict as an evolutionary dead end. The idea of a species that fought wars as a regular social function was like discovering that mathematics was optional. 18 wars in 10 standard years, she repeated slowly. Your species has fought 18 separate military conflicts in the past decade. Well, we're not always fighting each other, Torres clarified helpfully. Sometimes we team up against pirates or hostile corporate interests, though admittedly those tend to be smaller affairs. Pirates rarely have the resources for proper sieges. Ambassador Krelon had gone completely still, his iridescent wing membranes folded tight against his body in the Zalani equivalent of a defensive posture. His people settled disputes through elaborate ritual dances that could last for days, but rarely resulted in anything more serious than wounded pride and sore feet. But surely, he ventured, these were aberrations, unusual circumstances that forced your people into conflict? Commander Torres smiled again, and several patrons instinctively moved back from the bar. Ambassador, she said gently, what exactly do you think humans do for fun? The question hung in the air like a biological weapon waiting to activate. Trade Minister Gorth's rocky hide began to crack along stress fractures as he processed the implications. The Craxi were warriors by nature, but their conflicts followed strict ritualistic patterns that had evolved over millennia to minimize actual casualties. The concept of warfare as recreational activity was so far outside their cultural parameters that his translator was struggling to find appropriate metaphors. Fun, Dr. Yathara's chromatophores had settled into a steady pattern of distressed orange. You engage in warfare for entertainment. Not exclusively, Torres replied reasonably. We also have sports, though I suppose the distinction gets blurry sometimes. Have you ever watched American football? Or rugby? Or Australian rules football, which isn't really football at all, but involves considerably more violence than most actual wars? The bartender made a sound that might have been laughter or a death rattle. His homeworld's most popular sport involved floating in pools of scented oils while composing poetry. Physical contact was considered unspeakably rude. Counselor Vex High found his voice first. Commander Torres, he said carefully, when you say you stopped counting your kills after your first war, what exactly do you mean? Torres drained her glass and stood, straightening her uniform with practiced efficiency. The movement was purely functional, but it somehow conveyed the impression of someone checking weapons and ammunition out of long habit. I mean, Counselor, that keeping track became impractical, and ultimately irrelevant. She placed several credits on the bar, enough to cover her drinks and a generous tip that would ensure the bartender's discretion about the evening's conversation. The number isn't what matters. What matters is that when the shooting started, I was still standing when it stopped. She walked toward the exit with the measured pace of someone who had learned that haste was often the enemy of survival. At the doorway, she paused and looked back at the assembled diplomats, traders, and researchers who had gathered to hear humanity's military secrets revealed. Gentlemen, ladies, and beings of indeterminate gender, she said pleasantly, if you're truly curious about human warfare, you're asking the wrong questions. What questions should we be asking? Krelon called after her. Commander Torres smiled one final time, and for a moment the civilized veneer slipped enough to reveal something that had learned to find humor in places where hope went to die. Ask me how many I saved. Commander Torres hadn't made it 3 meters past the cantina's threshold when the gravitational pull of morbid curiosity dragged her back inside. The assembled beings had formed what could generously be called a discussion circle, though it resembled more of an emergency xenobiological conference with alcohol. You can't simply leave us with that statement, declared Professor Zixtel, the station's military historian whose entire academic career had been built on studying conflicts that involved casualty counts measured in dozens, not thousands. His crystalline body structure chimed softly as he gestured, creating harmonics that his species used to convey complex emotional states. Currently, the tune suggested academic excitement bordering on mania. Torres returned to her bar stool with the resigned air of someone accustomed to being the evening's entertainment. Professor, trust me, you don't want the complete picture. But we do, insisted Dr. Yathara, though her chromatophores were now cycling through colors that indicated severe psychological stress. From a purely scientific perspective, understanding human conflict, behavior could prove invaluable for future diplomatic endeavors. Diplomatic endeavors? Torres tasted the phrase like spoiled food. Right. Because nothing says peaceful negotiation like a detailed breakdown of orbital bombardment techniques. A new voice cut through the chatter, smooth, ancient, and carrying the weight of civilizations that had risen and fallen before most species had discovered fire. The young ones seek knowledge they lack the wisdom to process, human. Elder Morth-An had been sitting so still in the cantina's darkest corner that most patrons had mistaken him for decorative architecture. The Threnodi were among the galaxy's oldest surviving races, having achieved spaceflight when humanity was still debating whether fire was worth the effort. His presence at what had been a routine trade negotiation suggested tonight's conversation carried implications far beyond casual bar talk. Elder? Torres inclined her head respectfully. I didn't realize the Threnodi Council was monitoring our little gathering. We monitor many things, Commander, including species that demonstrate unusual survival patterns. Morthon's voice resonated with harmonics that bypassed the translation matrix entirely, speaking directly to the primitive brain centers that regulated fear responses. Your comment about saving lives intrigues me. Please elaborate. The request carried the weight of genuine authority, and Torres found herself complying despite every instinct screaming that this conversation was heading somewhere dangerous. Signia 7th, she began, settling back into her chair. Mining colony, 40,000 inhabitants, being overrun by automated defense systems that had gone rogue after a solar flare corrupted their programming. Professor Zixtel's harmonic output shifted to academic fascination. Automated defenses. Surely evacuation was the logical response. Can't evacuate when the defense grid controls all atmospheric flight paths. The colonists were trapped in underground shelters, while hunter-killer drones systematically eliminated anything that moved on the surface. Trade Minister Gorth's rocky exterior began developing the stress fractures that indicated deep discomfort. And your role in this situation? 3-person strike team. Myself, a demolitions expert, and a tech specialist. Torres accepted another drink from the increasingly fascinated bartender. Mission parameters: infiltrate the primary control facility, neutralize the central processing core, and restore manual override capabilities. 3 individuals against an entire automated defense network? Ambassador Krelon's wing membranes fluttered with what might have been admiration or horror. That seems statistically improbable. Humans don't do probability assessments the same way other species do, Torres replied. We tend to treat impossible odds as a starting point for creative problem-solving. Elder Morthon leaned forward with the careful movement of someone whose species had learned patience through geological timescales. Define creative problem-solving in this context. Torres's smile suggested that the universe's definition of creativity and humanity's definition occupied entirely different conceptual frameworks. We had a nuclear demolitions charge designed for asteroid mining operations, military-grade EMP generators, and approximately 6 hours before the colonists' air recycling systems failed permanently. The cantina had grown notably quieter as other patrons strained to follow a conversation that was venturing into territory their respective cultures had never needed to explore. Even the bartender had stopped pretending to work, all 4 arms frozen in the act of inventory management. Nuclear weapons, Dr. Yathara whispered, her chromatophores cycling through patterns that roughly translated to existential dread mixed with professional curiosity. You used nuclear weapons in a rescue operation? Underground detonation, precisely calculated yield, shaped charge configuration. Torres ticked off points on her fingers, as if discussing grocery lists. The blast wave disabled the processing core without compromising the colony's structural integrity, textbook application of controlled nuclear demolition. Professor Zixtel's harmonic output had shifted to something that sounded like a funeral dirge, composed by a mathematician having a nervous breakdown. Commander, forgive my ignorance, but how does one learn textbook nuclear demolition techniques? Standard military curriculum. Every human soldier receives basic training in battlefield nuclear deployment, containment protocols, and radiation management. It's considered fundamental knowledge, like first aid or equipment maintenance. The silence that followed this revelation could have been harvested and sold as a strategic resource. Trade Minister Gorth was the first to recover the power of speech. Every soldier, your entire military force receives nuclear weapons training. Well, not the administrative personnel, Torres clarified helpfully. Though most of them pick up the basics through cross-training initiatives, you never know when you might need to improvise a tactical nuclear solution to an unexpected problem. Elder Morthon's ancient features had arranged themselves into an expression that conveyed profound philosophical concern. Human, in my species' recorded history, we have encountered exactly 7 races that developed nuclear warfare capabilities. 6 of them destroyed themselves within 2 centuries of achieving atomic fission. The 7th. Let me guess, Torres interrupted gently. The 7th learned wisdom and abandoned such weapons in favor of peaceful coexistence? The 7th weaponized their sun and used it to sterilize 3 neighboring star systems before we could intervene. This information settled over the assembled beings like radioactive fallout, leaving everyone slightly less comfortable about the universe's fundamental nature. But you've survived, Counselor Vexhai observed, his mandibles clicking in patterns that suggested he was mentally revising his species' threat assessment protocols. Despite possessing these capabilities, humanity continues to exist. Torres nodded. We've gotten quite good at pointing our weapons in productive directions, which brings us back to Signia 7th. You saved 40,000 lives using nuclear weapons, Dr. Yathara said slowly, as if testing whether the concept made sense when spoken aloud. 40,216, Torres corrected. We got an accurate head count afterward. Turned out there were more colonists in the emergency shelters than the initial reports indicated. Professor Zixtel had begun producing harmonics that sounded suspiciously like the musical equivalent of hyperventilation. And this operation? Was it considered unusual by human military standards? Routine extraction mission, though we did receive commendations for completing it under budget and ahead of schedule. The bartender made a sound that might have been laughter, terror, or the death rattle of his faith in cosmic justice. His homeworld's military history consisted entirely of one afternoon when 2 rival poetry circles had engaged in competitive limerick composition until one side admitted defeat and bought drinks for everyone involved. Elder Morthon's voice carried new undertones of something that might have been respect, fear, or both. Commander Torres, how many such routine operations have you participated in throughout your career? Torres considered the question with the careful attention of someone mentally reviewing classified material. Officially, 47 successful missions with civilian preservation objectives. Unofficially, there were several incidents that remain restricted under the Galactic non-disclosure protocols. 47 operations where you used military force to save civilian populations, Ambassador Krelon repeated, his voice climbing toward frequencies that indicated complete cultural recalibration in progress. Sometimes the force was kinetic, sometimes nuclear, occasionally biological or chemical depending on the tactical requirements, Torres explained patiently. The specific methodology is less important than the operational outcome. Biological weapons? Dr. Yathara's chromatophores had locked onto a steady pattern of deep purple that indicated she was approaching the limits of her species' psychological flexibility. Precision-engineered pathogens designed to neutralize specific threat profiles without harming indigenous populations. Very technical work, requires extensive knowledge of xenobiology, atmospheric chemistry, and species-specific immune responses. The cantina had achieved the kind of silence typically reserved for religious ceremonies or public executions. Even the background hum of life support systems seemed muted, as if the station itself was holding its breath. Trade Minister Gorth broke the spell with a question that rumbled up from somewhere deep in his rocky core. Commander, how do your people define the concept of routine? Torres smiled. and for the first time that evening, the expression seemed genuinely amused rather than professionally courteous. Minister, that's exactly the sort of question your species should be asking. The revelation that humans treated nuclear demolition as standard rescue protocol had drawn additional attention from beings who normally avoided cantina conversations entirely. Security Chief Velnara materialized from whatever shadows Nexus Station security personnel inhabited when off-duty, her predator's instincts apparently triggered by discussions of weapons-grade solutions to civilian problems. Commander, Velnara's voice carried the flat professionalism of someone who had spent decades learning not to be surprised by the galaxy's capacity for violence. Your previous comments have raised certain administrative concerns. Torres raised an eyebrow. Administrative concerns? The kind that require incident reports filed in triplicate with threat assessment addendums. Velnara's species had evolved from apex predators, but even they had developed civilization by agreeing that some forms of violence were counterproductive. Specifically regarding human military doctrine and its implications for station security protocols. I haven't violated any station regulations, Torres pointed out reasonably. Not yet, but the evening is young, and your definition of routine operations appears to exist in a different conceptual universe than our risk management framework. Elder Morthon's ancient voice cut through the tension with the authority of geological time. Security Chief, your concerns are noted but irrelevant. We require information, not reassurance. His attention returned to Torres with the focused intensity of a species that had survived by learning when to pay attention. Commander, these 47 operations you mentioned, were they conducted against alien threats? The question landed with peculiar weight, and Torres's expression shifted subtly toward something that might have been melancholy if humans were capable of such straightforward emotions. No, Elder. Most of them were conducted against other humans. If the cantina had been quiet before, it now achieved the kind of silence typically associated with vacuum exposure or the heat death of the universe. Ambassador Krelon's wing membranes had folded so tightly against his body that he resembled a decorative statue someone had abandoned in a chair. Professor Zixtel's harmonic emissions had shifted to frequencies that suggested his entire understanding of warfare was undergoing catastrophic reconstruction. Against your own species? But how could that makes no evolutionary sense whatsoever? Evolution doesn't stop at the species level, Torres replied, settling back into what was becoming her permanent position as the evening's designated herald of uncomfortable truths. Humans compete with each other for resources, territory, ideological dominance, and occasionally just to prove that we can. Dr. Yathara's chromatophores had begun cycling through patterns that weren't in any translation database, probably because her species lacked conceptual frameworks for the emotions she was experiencing. You wage war against your own kind as a form of competition. Among other reasons, the pacification wars weren't about competition, exactly. They were about preventing Earth from becoming uninhabitable due to resource depletion and environmental collapse. Trade Minister Gorth's stress fractures had deepened into actual fissures, creating geological fault lines across his rocky exterior. Pacification wars. Please explain this terminology. Torres accepted another drink from the bartender, who had given up all pretense of normal business operations and was now openly recording the conversation for what would undoubtedly become the most valuable historical document in Cantina history. Earth's population reached 11 billion before we achieved reliable interplanetary colonization. Environmental degradation, resource scarcity, territorial disputes over habitable land, the usual pressures that come with overpopulation on a finite world. And your solution was warfare? Counselor Vexhigh's mandibles clicked in patterns that suggested he was trying to process information that violated several fundamental assumptions about intelligent behavior. Our solution was controlled population reduction through military action designed to preserve critical infrastructure while eliminating competing resource claims. Torres delivered this explanation with the matter-of-fact tone typically reserved for weather reports or shipping schedules. The pacification wars eliminated approximately 2 billion people over a 15-year period while maintaining agricultural production and technological capacity. The Cantina's atmospheric recycling system chose that moment to emit a grinding sound that perfectly captured everyone's emotional state. Security Chief Velnara had gone completely motionless in the way that predators do when they're recalculating everything they thought they knew about potential threats. 2 billion casualties in 15 years, conducted by your own species against itself. Well, casualties is a broad term, Torres clarified helpfully. Direct combat deaths were only about 60% of that total. The rest died from infrastructure collapse, supply chain disruption, disease outbreaks, and environmental factors related to the conflicts. Elder Morthan had begun producing subharmonic vibrations that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to the primitive brain structures responsible for existential dread. Commander, in our records of galactic civilizations, we have documented the rise and fall of approximately 3,000 intelligent species. Not one of them survived large-scale intra-species warfare. None of them were human, Torres pointed out with mathematical precision. Indeed, that appears to be the critical variable. Professor Zixtel had recovered enough cognitive function to formulate actual questions. How did your species maintain technological advancement while simultaneously engaging in population reduction warfare? Military research drives innovation faster than peaceful development. We made more technological progress during the pacification wars than in the previous 2 centuries combined. Torres gestured vaguely at the station around them. The fusion drives that brought us to galactic attention, developed as siege weapons, our atmospheric processing technology, designed to make enemy territories uninhabitable, medical advances, battlefield trauma response. Dr. Yathara's chromatophores had locked onto a pattern that roughly translated to, "Please let this be a particularly vivid nightmare." You're saying that human technological civilization was built on weapons research? Not built on it, but certainly accelerated by it. Competition breeds innovation, and warfare is competition refined to its most essential elements. Ambassador Krelon had found his voice, though it emerged as a barely audible whisper. Commander, how many humans participated in these pacification wars? Total military personnel across all factions and theaters of operation? Approximately 400 million. Torres paused to consider the mathematics. Though that number includes support staff, logistics personnel, and civilian contractors working in combat zones. 400 million soldiers, Counselor Vexhigh repeated slowly. Your species fielded 400 million military personnel to fight each other. Over the course of 15 years, across multiple continents and orbital installations, Torres corrected, peak deployment was around 60 million active combatants at any given time. Trade Minister Gorth's geological composition had developed new fault lines that suggested tectonic activity was occurring in real time. And this was considered normal? Torres smiled with the gentle patience of someone explaining basic physics to particularly slow children. Minister, the pacification wars ended 70 years ago. They're taught in our elementary schools as an example of effective resource management under pressure. The silence that followed this revelation could have been bottled and sold as a strategic reserve of horror. Security Chief Velnara had begun making subtle hand signals to something outside the cantina, probably requesting backup or perhaps arranging for immediate evacuation protocols. Commander Torres, when you say these wars are taught in elementary schools. Standard curriculum. Children learn the strategic principles, tactical innovations, and logistical frameworks that made the wars successful. It's considered essential knowledge for citizenship in an interplanetary society. You teach children warfare as a civic duty, Elder Morthon observed, his ancient voice carrying new harmonics that suggested even his species' vast experience with galactic civilizations hadn't prepared him for this conversation. We teach children that sometimes violence is the most efficient solution to complex problems, and that intelligent application of force can prevent larger catastrophes. Torres finished her drink and stood, straightening her uniform with the same mechanical precision she'd displayed all evening. The pacification wars prevented Earth's complete ecological collapse and made human expansion into space possible. 2 billion deaths prevented the extinction of our entire species. And you consider this successful? Dr. Yathara's question emerged as barely more than a chromatic flicker. Commander Torres looked around the assembled beings, diplomats, researchers, traders, and security personnel from dozens of worlds, all trying to process information that violated their fundamental assumptions about intelligence, civilization, and survival. Doctor, we're having this conversation on a space station orbiting a neutron star, surrounded by representatives from civilizations that span 300,000 light-years of known space. Her voice carried the quiet satisfaction of someone delivering a proof that had taken considerable effort to construct. 70 years ago, humans were trapped on a dying world eating recycled protein and breathing poisoned air. She moved toward the exit with the measured pace of someone who had learned that the most important victories were often the ones that looked like defeats to outside observers. I'd say the pacification wars were the most successful military campaign in human history. The door closed behind her with a soft hiss that sounded suspiciously like the universe exhaling in relief. Elder Morthon was the first to break the stunned silence that followed her departure. Emergency session, now. We need to discuss the human problem. The Nexus Station's primary assembly hall had hosted diplomatic crises before, but never one where the threat assessment involved a single individual sitting calmly in the defendant's chair while 36 galactic representatives debated whether her entire species represented an existential threat to organized civilization. Commander Torres occupied the center of the amphitheater with the relaxed posture of someone who had attended far more dangerous meetings in significantly less comfortable chairs. The emergency session had been called with such urgency that several ambassadors were still wearing their sleep attire, though the Threnody delegation had somehow managed to arrive in full ceremonial regalia, suggesting they'd been preparing for this conversation longer than anyone realized. The floor recognizes Elder Morthon of the Threnody Collective, announced mediator Kethval, whose species had evolved specifically to facilitate intergalactic communication, but was currently questioning whether some conversations were beyond the scope of civilized discourse. Elder Morthon rose with the deliberate movement of geological formations achieving consciousness. Honored colleagues, we convene tonight to address a paradigm that challenges our fundamental understanding of intelligent evolution. With respect, Elder, interrupted Ambassador Krelon, who had spent the past 3 hours researching human historical records and now looked like someone who had stared too long into an abyss that had stared back with interest. I believe the situation is more urgent than academic discussion warrants. The Zelani representative raises valid concerns, agreed Trade Minister Gorth, whose rocky exterior now resembled a topographical map of seismic disaster. We're discussing a species that has demonstrated the capacity to wage successful warfare against itself while maintaining technological advancement. The strategic implications are unprecedented. Counselor Vexhigh's mandibles clicked in patterns that suggested he was mentally drafting evacuation protocols for his entire homeworld. The question before this assembly is whether humanity represents a threat that requires containment measures. Commander Torres cleared her throat politely. If I may interject, gentlemen, you're still asking the wrong questions. The assembly hall fell silent with the peculiar quality of group attention that occurs when predators realize they might actually be prey. Commander Torres, Mediator Kethaval intoned formally, you stand before this assembly as a representative of your species. What questions should we be asking? Torres stood with fluid grace, her movement economical and precise in the way that suggested extensive training in confined space combat operations. You should be asking why humanity was invited to join the galactic community in the first place. Dr. Yathara's chromatophores flickered through patterns that indicated confused hope mixed with persistent dread. We assumed it was standard protocol for newly spacefaring civilizations that demonstrated technological competence. Doctor, when has the Galactic Assembly ever operated on assumptions? Torres smiled with the patient amusement of someone who had spent considerable time studying organizational behavior under stress. Elder Morthon, perhaps you'd care to enlighten the Assembly about the Threnody Council's actual role in human first contact protocols? Elder Morthon's ancient features arranged themselves into an expression that might have been approval, resignation, or both. The human speaks truly. We did not discover humanity by accident. The admission landed in the assembly hall like a tactical nuclear weapon detonating in a flower garden. Ambassador Krelon's wing membranes began fluttering in patterns that indicated complete cognitive recalibration was occurring in real time. Elder, are you saying the Threnody Council deliberately sought contact with humanity? We have been monitoring Earth for approximately 2,000 standard years, Morthon replied, with the calm detachment of someone discussing weather patterns rather than galactic conspiracy. Waiting for humanity to achieve sufficient technological development to be useful. Professor Zixtel's harmonic output had shifted to frequencies that sounded like a computer attempting to process contradictory data while experiencing cascading system failures. Useful for what purpose? Commander Torres answered before Elder Morthon could respond. Professor, what do you know about the Void Hunters? The name struck the assembly like a psychological weapon designed to target every species' deepest evolutionary fears. Several ambassadors began making unconscious protective gestures, while others activated emergency communication protocols with their homeworlds. Security Chief Velnara had gone completely motionless in the Predator equivalent of playing dead. Commander, that designation is classified at levels that exceed this assembly's security clearance. Not anymore, Torres replied cheerfully. As of 6 hours ago, the Galactic Defense Protocol Classification Authority declassified all Void Hunter-related intelligence for distribution to Assembly members. 6 hours ago, Mediator Kethaval repeated slowly, shortly after your conversation in the cantina. What an interesting coincidence, Torres agreed, with mock innocence. Elder Morthon's voice resonated with harmonics that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to survival instincts honed across millions of years of evolution. The Void Hunters represent an extragalactic threat that our combined civilizations cannot defeat through conventional means. Extragalactic entities that consume organized matter on a stellar scale, Dr. Yathara whispered, her chromatophores locked onto patterns that roughly translated to, "Please let this be an educational simulation." Correct. They arrive without warning, strip entire star systems of usable material, and move on to the next target. No communication, no negotiation, no mercy. Torres began pacing the assembly floor with the measured stride of someone delivering a briefing to junior officers. 3 previous galactic civilizations have encountered Void Hunter incursions. None survived. Trade Minister Gorth's geological composition had developed new stress fractures that suggested his entire understanding of galactic politics was undergoing tectonic shift. And humanity factors into this threat, how exactly? Minister, what's the one military capability that every galactic civilization lacks? Torres asked, with the patient tone of someone conducting a teaching exercise. The ability to wage successful warfare against our own kind, Counselor Vexhai answered, his mandibles clicking in, patterns that indicated reluctant comprehension. Precisely. Every species in the galactic community evolved past intraspecies conflict before achieving spaceflight. You've all developed beautiful, sophisticated civilizations based on cooperation, resource sharing, and peaceful conflict resolution. Torres's smile carried genuine warmth, mixed with something that might have been pity. Which makes you absolutely useless when faced with an enemy that doesn't care about your diplomatic traditions? The assembly hall achieved the kind of silence typically reserved for the moment, between lightning and thunder. Ambassador Krelon found his voice first. You're saying humanity was recruited as weapons? We were recruited as specialists in applied violence, Torres corrected gently. The galactic community produces excellent scientists, engineers, philosophers, and artists. But when the Void Hunters arrive, and Elder Morthon's intelligence suggests they will arrive within the next 50 standard years, you'll need someone who understands how to win wars against enemies that can't be reasoned with. And the pacification wars were training? Dr. Yathara's question emerged as barely more than a chromatic flicker. The pacification wars were humanity learning how to make hard choices under impossible circumstances, how to sacrifice billions to save trillions, how to use maximum force efficiently while preserving critical resources. Torres stopped pacing and faced the assembly directly. Every human military officer has studied those campaigns because they represent our species' greatest achievement in strategic thinking. Professor Zixtel's harmonic emissions had settled into frequencies that sounded like mathematical equations, achieving consciousness and immediately regretting the decision. Commander, when you said you stopped counting kills after your first war, I meant that individual deaths became irrelevant compared to population preservation objectives, Torres finished. The Void Hunters don't take prisoners, Professor. They don't negotiate surrender terms. They consume everything in their path until there's nothing left to consume. Elder Morthon rose with the gravity of geological time achieving purpose. The human speaks truth. Our projections indicate that conventional galactic defense capabilities have a 0% probability of success against Void Hunter technology. And humanity's probability of success? Mediator Kethaval asked, though his voice suggested he was afraid of the answer. Commander Torres smiled one final time, and for the first time all evening the expression reached her eyes. We haven't lost a war yet. The silence that followed contained the weight of civilizations, realizing that their survival depended on the very qualities that had terrified them moments before. Gentlemen, ladies, and beings of indeterminate gender, Torres said, straightening her uniform with the mechanical precision that had become her trademark. When the Void Hunters arrive, you won't be asking how many enemies I've killed. She paused at the assembly hall's exit, looking back at representatives from dozens of worlds who were frantically recalculating everything they thought they knew about humanity's place in galactic civilization. You'll be asking how many of you I can save. The door closed behind her with the soft finality of a weapon being chambered. Outside the station's viewports, the stars continued their ancient dance, unaware that the galaxy's newest and most dangerous species had just accepted responsibility for their preservation.